What time is it? 10 to 11.
Are you out of here? Yeah, that's fine. Enough coffee.
You guys are living something real well, she was around.
I don't eat today.
That's a smart choice. I think you gotta make them fix dinner.
Okay. Well, good morning again. The sound is on, isn't it? You can hear well? Okay. Well, I notice Brian is not here, and he's the timekeeper. So we should designate a substitute Brian, I think, to stop me at some point later this morning. This session is intended for us to consider the research that I've been doing over the past couple of years, as I alluded to in the sermon. I've been especially interviewing through an oral history process individuals who have felt the call to ministry and who also identify as LGBTQ. And I'm going to be using the term people who identify as queer. And please know that I am using that in the sense that has become quite common and commonly accepted within the LGBTQ community, that although the term queer used to be an epithet and a very derogatory term, and I think many of us came of an age where that was the case, that is no longer the case. So when you hear me say queer, I'm using it as a term that many people do identify and take on with actually pride. What I've discovered in looking at these Mennonite leaders and people who have been in Mennonite institutions is that there has been a certain out-migration outside, now going out of Mennonite churches for the last number of decades, because this has not been a very progressive or hospitable place for them to exercise their gifts. But I've also found that denominational boundaries are porous and malleable, and sometimes people go out, but then they also find their way to come back in. That is happening actually quite a bit right now. And there are also many people, it turns out, that did not grow up Mennonite and don't maybe have any kind of ethnic or family Mennonite identity, but they have been drawn to being Mennonites perhaps because of the peace tradition or the social justice things that they associate with Mennonites, and they have come in to this denomination relatively recently, and they happen to be LGBTQ, and so they've come into a denomination that is having a really hard time trying to figure out what to do with LGBTQ people, just as they are coming in with great gifts and excitement and wanting to be in leadership. And those are some of the people I've been interviewing. So I'm going to be showing you pictures and talking about some of these folks' experiences. I've also learned that not everybody thinks about Mennonite identity or Mennonite affiliation as something that has to be the only way they think of themselves in terms of their own religious identity, but some people have embraced kind of a hybrid identity, saying, for example, I am firmly Mennonite and I am also firmly Unitarian Universalist. You know, they are embracing two traditions now, and they're not just trading in one for the other. So that's been very interesting for me to learn about. And I will say just a little bit about this slide. I mentioned in the sermon there is an organization called Brethren Mennonite Council for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender interests. They were founded now a little over 40 years ago as an advocacy organization, and they have a base in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I have, in many ways, am indebted to them for putting me in touch with people who would be willing to be interviewed. I started this project not knowing who in the world would talk to me. I'm a historian. I don't come out of this particular organization and haven't been identified with it in the past. But what I found was that if people are asked would they like to tell their story, in many, many cases people who are LGBTQ feel like their stories really have not been told, and so they welcomed this. And so there's been kind of we call it a snowball effect, that one person talks to me and then they tell their friends that, hey, there's this historian in Kansas and she's interested in this, and would you talk to her? And then they say yes, and then those people also have friends. So that is how I have managed to find all these folks who've been willing to share their stories. I also wanted to acknowledge something that you might find interesting, and that is that I consider this project to grow directly out of the research that I did in 2014 and 2015 on sexual abuse in the Mennonite Church and John Howard Yoder's particularly egregious sexual abuse of women in the Mennonite Church. When I was doing that study, I became very aware that at the seminary in Elkhart, Indiana, the Mennonite Seminary, AMBS, and other institutions in the 1970s and 80s, particularly when Yoder was perpetrating his abuse, and it was not being dealt with well by Mennonite institutional leaders around him, that was a very inhospitable time for women who were hoping to move into leadership, either as pastors or missionaries or theologians or as church administrators. It was a very strongly patriarchal tradition that sort of informed how Mennonite institutions protected Yoder and often did not believe women and did not surround women with support. And as a woman who's a little bit younger than many of those women that experienced that, I felt actually pretty angry about that, because I felt like as a Mennonite girl growing up in the broader church, I would have benefited, so would many other people have benefited from having had more women as our models, as people that we would have heard preaching, as someone who would have been mentors to us. But I learned in that project that many women had sort of gone off the path of being Mennonite leaders and went and did something else. Maybe they became teachers, maybe they became social workers, maybe they went into healthcare fields. They went and did something, and they made their contributions, but they generally, many of them were not becoming Mennonite ministers because of that whole pretty tawdry story about sexual abuse being covered up. So I began to think then, well, that's really maddening that happened 30, 40 years ago. And I started making the connection, what about leaders today, leaders who aspire to be in our churches as preachers, as church administrators, but they're being denied leadership because of their sexual identity. And for me, that was a connection that I hadn't made before, but once I made it, I kept thinking about it, and I thought, who is going around and finding out the stories of all these people who by now must have left, right? I mean, our church is poorer, our denomination is poorer for the way that we have treated people who aspire to be leaders, but because of their sexual identity, we have not embraced them. So that was really the motivation for me to do this work. And I want to begin also by just making two points of where I think we are right now in this denomination. One is that I think it's a pretty hopeful time for many LGBTQ leaders. They're encouraged by the recent hiring and licensing and ordination to ministry of quite a few folks, even in the last 3 to 4 years in Mennonite Church USA, and this is also happening in Canada, so that the pace of change in terms of allowing people to be licensed and ordained as ministers, that is happening quickly right now, kind of before our eyes. Even since I began this project, I know of some number of people who have had this happen, and they in earlier decades wouldn't have thought it would have been possible for them to be licensed and ordained as Mennonite ministers, and now they are. Very recent development. And the second key point I want to start with is that allies are encouraged to step up and speak out for the well-being of everybody in Mennonite settings, including those who have been historically excluded. Most of the people that I'm going to be showing you here, their pictures, do identify as LGBTQ, but at least one, the next picture, the first profile that I'll have here is of an ally, someone who has been speaking out for a long time. And you might recognize her because she lives all of 25 miles down the road. She's from Lawrence, Kansas. Her name is Joanna Herriter. She's been involved in the Inclusive Pastors advocacy group in Mennonite Church USA for the last decade. And I interviewed Joanna about a year and a half ago surrounding her work as an ally. And she says, this is a quote from her, she says, "My spirituality has been enriched by being invited into predominantly queer spaces and to being in worship services led by queer people. That has been a blessing for my spirituality." She goes on to say, "When you listen to an oppressed voice, it helps you to view Scripture in new ways." She adds, "I've tried to help my congregation, Peace Mennonite of Lawrence, to understand our theological stance, how the principles that Jesus carried out are welcoming." And she has a long record of taking a leading role in pushing our denomination in this particular direction to be more inclusive. When I interviewed her, one of the last things she said to me was, "In my ideal world, Mennonites will one day repent of the sins of homophobia." And I know some of you were here maybe in January when Brad Siebert gave a sermon where he was talking about the nature of sin and the many kinds of sin that exist. And I thought Joanna's quote was interesting in that regard. This is about the first of 9 profiles of leaders that I'm going to give you this morning. And I also want to say at the beginning that every one of these 9 have given me explicit permission to identify them by face and by name. So I'm not, telling tales on anyone here. And there also were people I interviewed who did not want to be identified. So I'm not sharing those stories. You might recognize, maybe not this name of Paula Northwood, but if I would say the name Paula Diller-Lehman, there probably are a few of you who recognize that name. Paula Diller-Lehman, this woman was born and raised in Ohio, and back in the 1990s, she was the longtime youth ministries leader and a co-editor, associate editor of With Magazine. With Magazine was the magazine for Mennonite youth in that time period in the General Conference Mennonite Church. Paula lived around the Newton community. Her husband Tim was a pastor in Mound Ridge, Kansas, and then eventually Paula was ordained to co-pastor the Faith Mennonite Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with her husband Tim. So you might know those names, Tim and Paula, Tim Lehman and Paula Diller-Lehman. After years of being closeted in terms of her sexual identity and finally being what she told me was convicted by my own preaching of living with integrity, she was out. She came out in midlife. She also then was rather immediately ousted. So this is actually a story of being expelled from the Mennonite church. Living in Minnesota as she did and having a church there in Minneapolis, the Northern District Conference officials that were her regional body asked that she relinquish her ministerial credential, and she challenged that. She did not want to relinquish. She wanted to continue to be a minister in the Mennonite church. However, they forced the issue. She did lose her congregation. And when I interviewed her a couple years ago, she told me how it's taken a very long time to get her life back, but in the past 2 decades, she has earned a Doctor of Ministry degree. She's moved on to another denomination, the Congregational Church, and currently she is in her 16th year of ministry with Plymouth Congregational Church in downtown Minneapolis, Minnesota. Her title now is Acting Senior Minister of about a 2,500 person congregation. At the time that she had left Faith Mennonite or was pushed out of Faith Mennonite in Minneapolis in the mid-1990s, she remembers, quote, "I was devastated. I lost my job, my spiritual community. I felt like I lost my whole family." Now, decades later, she is thriving. Her perspective is nuanced. She says, the thing that being forced out of the Mennonite church has done for me is to open my eyes to other denominations, the UCC, the American Baptists, that are doing good work in the world. And she adds, I consider myself ethnically a Mennonite and consider myself theologically an Anabaptist. Had I not come out and left it, I think I would have continued to aspire to do great things in the Mennonite church. And she was quite emotional about being interviewed about her past. She said in 20 years, Mennonites had not asked her what had ever happened with her life. So it was really a very interesting experience for me to become acquainted with her. Krista Taves was raised in a progressive Mennonite church in Ontario, Canada. Her journey has taken her to the Unitarian Universalists, where she now pastors several congregations in the Midwest. That tradition, the UUs, Unitarian Universalists, began being open to gay leaders already back in the 1970s. What it means to be Mennonite and Unitarian Universalist, she says, is a constant theme. In my spiritual journey, I am fully both. So she's someone that embraces these two traditions. She says, ordained as a UU minister in 2004, I felt like I'd arrived at a good place, a good new denomination for myself. Both the UUs and Anabaptists come from the Radical Reformation. I learned this in my seminary classes, and I did my own study of the history. I didn't have to leave behind all of my Anabaptist upbringing. There was a sense of bringing my Mennonite values into my UU world. As Anabaptists, she says, we are a peace church. We have a hermeneutics of suspicion. We emphasize humility. We have an emphasis on community, the value of the collective. She says the Unitarian Universalist downfall, what she criticizes or critiques about the Unitarian Universalists, is they can be hyper-individualistic. She says, I bring that struggle into my preaching to the people I serve. In my theology, I've shifted away from Orthodox Christianity, but I look for yearnings for reconciliation and justice. And she adds, it's not the role of the oppressed to undo other people's oppressiveness. Our responsibility is to survive and to thrive. Some of you recognize Sarah Clausen. She was here as a guest preacher in our Southern Hills congregation about 2.5 years ago. And since then, in 2017, she accepted a position pastoring a Disciples of Christ congregation in Columbia, Missouri. She went to Vanderbilt Divinity School and there studied black liberation. She studied queer theology. She was looking for people to share something besides ethnic identity or Mennonite denominational institutions. She says, if we can get away from those kinds of things, it just makes sense that I'm here in Columbia in this local Disciples of Christ congregation, which is a peace church, which does social justice work, that prioritizes service. She says, I learned at Vanderbilt that there's not one thing wrong with me or my sexual orientation. All that's wrong is wrong with the church. And I developed great confidence around that. She continues, and this is a quote from Sarah, and by the way, she is a sister of Daniel Clausen in our congregation, so maybe some of you already know that connection. She said, that's a great gift of my coming out from the Mennonite denomination. I wouldn't be able to see or think these things if I just found my Mennonite church and been called and had this loyalty to the denomination. Now, as an outsider and a person with feet in a lot of different places, I don't have a vested interest in upholding structures for their own sake. So she's someone who has left and has embraced another denominational identity. This is Erica Lee Simke. I am actually looking forward to meeting her in person for the first time next week because Dwayne and I are planning to go visit our daughter Elsa, who's now attending the Albuquerque Mennonite Church, and Erica is the pastor there. She is the first openly LGBTQ individual called to be a solo pastor, having kind of her own church in an MCUSA congregation. And Erica says, since I came out some years ago, I regularly receive emails from folks who say I'm gay and I'm Christian, or I'm transgender and I'm Christian. And I've been able to have significant, at least twice life-saving conversations with folks, mostly young adults, because I'm a pastor, I'm serving the church, and because I'm out. Her concern is echoed by a woman who I also interviewed named Carol Wise. Some of you might know Carol Wise's name as Executive Director of the Brethren Mennonite Council for LGBT Interests. Carol points out that queer church leaders have to think about what is our responsibility to LGBT kids. And we know that often kids are bullied in school if they are seen as different. We know that suicide rates and attempted suicide of LGBTQ children and youth is a problem in our society. So these are matters that are very, very serious. And this is the kind of thing that Erica feels like she's been able to make some difference in the lives of some by authentically being herself as a leader. I am pretty excited to know that this very day, this morning, Michelle Burkholder, who I interviewed about a year ago, is actually going through her ordination service at the Hyattsville Mennonite Church in Hyattsville, Maryland. And there are many people that have come to surround her and her family with great, great joy today. So Michelle is the newest person to become ordained, and this is a red letter day for her and her congregation. Michelle grew up in the Virginia Mennonite Conference, and her father was the conference minister, Virginia Mennonite, based in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And she's someone who grew up in a difficult situation in that she knew from a very young age, I think already as a preschooler, she told me, as a elementary school age child, she knew that she was different. She grew up in a family that embraced and surrounded her with love, but she also grew up really quite closeted. She did not feel, especially with her father's position as a Mennonite leader in a very conservative area, it was difficult to be herself growing up. When I interviewed Michelle, she said, I've stuck with Mennonites a long time, her whole life, and I expect to stay. She is not moving out of this denomination. She says, I will always identify as Mennonite. She adds, I am optimistic by nature, and I choose to be optimistic. I was closeted for so long. I see changes happening in the church, but tempered by the reality there are a lot of churches that are still not welcoming. I get emails from youth across the church. They are queer and they don't have a supportive community, but they're glad that I do. That's heartbreaking, she says. There's also part of me, she says, that is unengaged. The broader church is not picking up on becoming as welcoming as much as it could be, and that's their loss. So yes, I've been especially thinking of Michelle today and the celebration of her ordination at Hyattsville in the D.C. area. Of all the pictures that I'll be showing here today, probably the name, at least that is best known of all of these, maybe it would be Theda Good. Theda was licensed and then ordained at the First Mennonite Church of Denver, Colorado, and then more recently she's taken a position as pastor in the First Mennonite Church in Bluffton, Ohio. So she's currently based in Bluffton, not in Colorado. During our interview last year, I mentioned it's interesting how quickly more queer Mennonites are coming into pastoral leadership in the past few years, and she replied, well, I've been eager to have company, because she was the first of these folks who was licensed in MCUSA, and of course it was very, very controversial. There was a lot of media attention on Theda, and Theda, it has a somewhat retiring and introverted personality, not someone who sought the spotlight, and yet has been a strong advocate for other people to come into ministry, as she has been able to do. Regarding the Brethren Mennonite Council on LGBT Interest, she said, I'm on the board, and now I'm also on the Leadership Council of the Inclusive Pastors. I feel very committed to being a member of these two groups. Being poster person for all of this is nothing I would have ever sought. It found me. But now I feel called to be involved. I want to bring light and love to people who are still closeted, and in rural communities, this is on my mind as I think about living and working in rural central Ohio. And this picture was taken at the time of her ordination. Theda is in the rainbow stole in the front. The Denver congregation is in the Mountain States Mennonite Regional Conference, and Randy Spalding's story also is a Mountain States story. Randy's had a very long career as a Mennonite musician, a minister, a songwriter, a compiler of some of the hymnals that are used by congregations, including our congregation throughout the U.S. and Canada. But when Randy came out as gay in 2009, at which point he was already mid-career, Mennonite Church USA forced him off the binational hymnal committee that he was chairing. That was the committee that was a predecessor to the committee that Cynthia Neufeld-Smith is currently on. There was an earlier iteration of that dealt with both people in Canada, Mennonites in Canada, and Mennonites in the U.S. He was forced off that committee, which he describes as a very painful process. Essentially, he said it was excommunication, a Mennonite excommunication story. He then, after 2009, left the Mennonites. He completed a Master's of Divinity degree at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. While he was in New Haven, he became affiliated with the Unitarian Universalists, and he served as an oncology chaplain, a cancer chaplain at a hospital in New Haven. But an interesting twist, about a year and a half ago, he was called to be the new pastor at Boulder Mennonite Church in Colorado. And at this point, he remains credentialed with the Unitarian Universalists, and at the same time, his installation service and his celebration of licensing, and now more recently in February this year, his ordination at Boulder Mennonite has just taken place. So he is licensed in both of these traditions, the Unitarian Universalists and the Mennonites. Of his journey, he recounts back in the late 1980s, and he grew up in northern Indiana, around the Goossen, Indiana area. That's his home area. Back in the late 1980s, I got married because I thought, quote, "This is how God will heal me." He was struggling with his sense of being gay at that time. And 1 year into his marriage, in the late 1980s, he says, I had a kind of breakdown. And I talked with my wife about things that had happened and what I was dealing with. And then I found a counselor doing reparative therapy. And I don't know if you've heard of that term before, but reparative therapy would be the idea of pushing someone against those feelings of being LGBTQ and making them become heterosexual. Randy continues, that was a total disaster, that therapy. My former wife is straight. She's an advocate for queer rights. We divorced in 2006 after 18 years of marriage. Also, besides the woman I was married to being supportive of me, he says, my mother has also been a supporter. I waited until age 40 to come out. But not everyone has had the same supportive response. I have one conservative brother who will step out of family group photos if my husband gets in the group picture in northern Indiana. About his relatively recent move to Boulder, Colorado, Randy says that serving a Mennonite congregation is not going back to the Mennonites. That's not what this is. People have said to me recently in coming to Boulder, glad you're back. But I have responded that I am still part of the Unitarian Universalist faith while serving a Mennonite congregation. I'm moving forward, not back. Whereas some of the older leaders that I featured here, like Paula Northwood, were essentially forced out of jobs a generation ago, younger ministers are weighing their options and some are managing to stay in Mennonite settings. These changing circumstances surely must be a bittersweet evolution from the perspective of Mennonite individuals who years ago felt called to ministry but were certain there would never be a place for them because of their sexual orientation. So I'm going to speak here about Russ Schmidt, and our Alexandroville friends still here, Judy and Tim? Oh, they took off. Okay, they would likely know Russ Schmidt, who is second from the left here holding the quilt. He's a Central Kansas native. He grew up in the Alexandroville Church near Goossen. He overlapped with me as a student at Bethel College in the early 1980s. And Russ's earliest memory from the age of 4 in the 1960s, Russ told his family, when I grow up, I'm going to be a preacher. So he had this childhood sense of himself. But by 1980, when he graduated from Bethel, he says, I was very closeted. He then joined Mennonite Voluntary Service in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he then came out as a gay man to several of his close friends there. But as a young gay man, he knew that Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana, would not accept him as a potential ministerial candidate. They were at that point in time specifically turning people away if they identified as gay. So in 1982, Russ headed for an alternative choice of theological school. He went to the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. And after completing his theological degree, he trained to become a nurse and is a registered nurse yet today. For 3 decades, Russ has lived and worked in the Bay Area. When I interviewed him, he says, I consider myself Anabaptist, Mennonite, yes, absolutely, and it's on my own terms. At First Mennonite Church of San Francisco, I've done nearly everything in the church. I'm one of the old-timers now. I've been the local coordinator for Mennonite Voluntary Service. I've been the interim pastor, and I've been on different leadership teams, and occasionally I preach. I'm not at all invested in being licensed or ordained, but I'm a lay leader. And I think that his narrative can be read as a reconciliation story, but it is also clearly a story of loss, of roads not pursued because of sexual identity and because of the barriers that were put up before him within Mennonite institutions for people like Russ who have felt a sense of call to ministry over decades. Jason Fry graduated from Bluffton College in 2010. While he was a student at Bluffton, he was deeply involved in religious studies through his major, his campus chapel ministry. He was involved in music and drama, and he participated in the Ministry Inquiry Program, which is a program where at colleges students can go spend a semester or a summer interning in various congregations. He did all of that. He also came out as gay during his college years. As an intern at the First Mennonite Church in Bluffton, he told one of the pastors in the Central District Conference that, quote, I was feeling called to a place that didn't exist yet. Doors were opening, I was having a lot of intense experiences, and there was a feeling that I could keep moving on. He was feeling called to ministry, but he also knew as a gay person that it wasn't just clear what that journey was going to look like. Jason then did go on to complete a Master's of Divinity degree from Princeton, and he has kept his many, many Mennonite ties. He participated in the most recent MCUSA conference that was in Orlando, Florida a couple years ago, and now currently he's working on his doctorate in ethics at Chicago Theological Seminary. He told me, Mennonites I have known still have a desire to connect back, even as they've found sanctuary in non-Mennonite spaces. And he adds that a gift of a lot of LGBTQ Mennonites is that we struggle with the question of what it means to be Mennonite, whereas straight Mennonites may not. They may just take that for granted. This idea that being marginalized prompts people to think about the central tenets of faith-based institutions and of Mennonite communities in particular rings true for many of the individuals that I've interviewed. Some congregations and educational institutions and other spaces across Mennonite and Anabaptist faith communities encourage questioning of faith traditions and practices, and they embrace a spectrum of spiritual belief and religious commitments. And yet, as we know, other Mennonites are far less open to questioning or being on the margins. A few months after I interviewed Jason, he sent me an update. He said that recently he has joined a United Church of Christ congregation, and he is now beginning the ordination process in that denomination. He's becoming a UCC pastor. He's cautiously hopeful about the future of inclusion in the Mennonite church, and he calls himself an ecumenical Mennonite who engages other faith traditions. The Mennonites, he says, are becoming more welcoming, but those changes are coming too late for me. So that was one of the senses of loss that I took amongst these interviews. And I want to leave time for questions and comments from you. As we've seen, A number of people have left Mennonite churches and institutions, and then others are embracing Mennonite identity and continuing to stay engaged in the church because they see potential for transformation. And one final point I wanted to make is that all of this, for me, calls into question even the notion of what is a denomination. You know, that it's maybe not as fixed. The Mennonite denomination is not as fixed as we might often think when we use that kind of language. There are some rapidly changing dynamics happening. People are coming and going, and if they go, they're carrying their Mennonite and their Anabaptist identities and commitments with them into other places as they move. I want to end here with these images of young activists. The upper picture is at Bethel College here in Kansas, where every spring they have a Pride and Diversity Week. So Bethel College has become actually quite specifically inclusive of LGBTQ people who are in and around the campus. And then the bottom picture is a picture taken at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 2015 at the most recent gathering of Mennonite World Conference. So these were young activists who take on the label Pink Menno as an advocacy organization. Pink Menno has mostly been a U.S.-based body of people, but some of these folks are from other countries as well, particularly European countries. So that is what I have. So let me just end there, and we'll leave this slide up. But comments from people or questions, I'd be happy to hear from you. Yes, Phil.
Did you have any contact with John Lynchide in your research? I don't know. I haven't kept up with it.
Yeah, John. For those people that don't know John grew up in Goossen, Kansas, and then was a pastor in the 1980s at Peace Mennonite Church in Lawrence, and now for many, many, many years has lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is now really a lay leader in the Germantown Mennonite Church. I did not seek to interview John because I heard from a number of people close to John that years ago he decided he was tired of telling his story. He got tired of being sort of the poster child of a Mennonite pastor who was pushed out, and that happened when he was at Lawrence, Kansas. So out of respect for that, I did not write to him. I think he likely knows about the work I've done, and I may engage with him in the future. I've been surprised that many people actually have wanted to engage with me, but I haven't had those conversations with John particularly.
One of the plans to discuss this issue at the Mennonite Conference this summer in Kansas City.
Well, thank you for asking, Jim, because that's an interesting developing story. I gave a number of lectures at Bethel College at the Menno Simons Lectures in October, and around these same issues and even some of the very same material I'm presenting here. Brethren Mennonite Council immediately asked me if I would present this material at the Kansas City conference at the convention at a seminar. And I said I'd be happy to. I would be happy to either propose that to the convention planners on my own as sort of Rachel Goossen, Washburn history professor, or if Brethren Mennonite Council wanted to present me as someone that they were sponsoring, I'd be happy to do that. And they chose to do that. And I learned a week and a half ago that all of the seminars proposed by Brethren Mennonite Council, including mine, were all rejected by the conference planners. So I was quite shocked at that. The Mennonite Brethren Council people were also very surprised. I think there may now be some efforts to find a venue near the convention in Kansas City to present a number of presentations that would be along these lines, but that has not been decided yet. And I'm not privy to what else is being planned at the conference. So, are you, Brad, involved in as a delegate?
A little bit about this. study the resolutions in time for the conference. The plan is at this point to continue what happened in 2017 at the Orlando conference and have the delegate session be organized as a future church summit. And certainly issues concerning LGBTQ inclusion and ministry will come up there because I'm going to be a delegate. And I know that Sam is interested. I know that others are interested too. Plus, we have now at that conference will be the moratorium on discussing LGBTQ issues in relationship to the membership guidelines resolution in 2015. They put a 4-year moratorium on discussion of things related to this issue, and that will end in Kansas City. And so discussion is sure to come up there because there's sort of a backlog, and these ways that we Mennonites have of silencing ourselves and saying that we can't talk about certain things, would be another thing I would want to bring up. I think that saying, that we can't talk about things is another part of what I constitute as the social violence we do each other, silencing voices, saying that you've got to hold your peace until, because other people have said it's too troubling to talk about such things.
Would that be the moratorium be the reason that these were rejected?
I haven't heard of any rationale. I only got sort of a very general email saying that my seminar had been rejected, but I didn't know that all of them had been rejected from BMC until the BMC person told me that. And that's just in the last week or so. So I don't know if any of this will be reconsidered yet. But I think pretty soon the publication comes out for what all the seminars are. So I think soon we'll see that, and these won't be there. So I don't know, Raylene. It seems really crazy at this particular time in our denominational history. And I mean, I'm an ally, so for me not to be able to share this is not damage to me so much. What I feel for are the people who do identify as queer, and their voices are being silenced in this way. To me, that's as Brad said, that is doing violence to folk. So. Yeah, Phil.
Rachel, I'm just curious as to whether either in the study you did or in your teaching you encountered the same thing I have, which is the enormous generational change in terms of attitudes and approaches to these issues. At the law school, at least for the last, say, 10 years, it's not an issue among people who are in that generation.
Right.
And that doesn't make any difference whether they're liberal or conservative or
Right.
Democrat or Republican. This is no more an issue than racial hostility or things of that sort. And it's just the notion of acceptance is virtually universal among people who are at that age. That problems are with people in a different generation, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah, I think that's true. Certainly, I would have some theologically conservative students at Washburn who would hear a presentation I might make, for example, in my Anabaptist Mennonite history class, and not feel necessarily comfortable with a progressive direction that Christian denominations are going. So I think there's diversity in my classrooms, but I do think that there is a strong generational difference, and I think that when people have said, when we look at the demographics of our Mennonite churches sort of shrinking, and young people maybe don't want to stay, some of it may be because young people see that these churches are really lagging behind the culture, and they don't want to be part of a discriminatory institution, and I would agree with that. I think that is something that we should take seriously. All right. I'll be Brian and say, sounds like the bell just rang. Time for people to go have lunch. Thanks.